I love listening to podcasts. They deliver useful and valuable knowledge in a way that can be more practical and tangible than an audiobook, and at the same time, you really feel like you get to know the person you're listening to for hours. So today, I want to tell you about my favorite podcasts right now in the categories news, health, self-improvement, and technology. Let's go. Okay, so let's start off with the news category. For me, the main news podcast I listen to is the What's News podcast by the Wall Street Journal. It comes out twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, and I don't listen to every episode, but in general, it gives a great overview of topics that are relevant right now. It is more US focused, but if you want a general broad overview over what's going on in the world, I think this is a great podcast. I really like the speakers there, and it's really nice to listen to. I used to not really listen to stuff like that, didn't read the news because I thought I wasn't interested in politics, and I still am not hugely into politics, but now I realize that it's important to at least know the basics and know what's kind of broadly going on, and so that's a great way to catch up on the latest news. I usually listen to 1 or 2 episodes in the morning and then I kind of know what's going on for the day. And the next one, if you're more into tech, also by the Wall Street Journal, is the Tech News Briefing podcast, which deals with kind of tech-related news topics. So that's mostly concerning kind of more macro developments in the tech space, new innovations, and stuff about the biggest companies in the tech space. As a tech enthusiast, I think it's really important to know about what's going on in the world of tech and kind of know about the most recent innovations. And with this podcast, which is really short actually, I get a great overview every day. Okay, so those are all the podcasts in the news category I listen to because in general, I don't really listen to a lot of news, but with those two, I think you get a great overview. For me, kind of more focused on the tech space, but you can pick like a second one instead of Tech News Briefing, which goes more into the space you're interested in. But if you're listening to my channel, I think it's pretty likely that you're also into tech. Okay, so moving on to a category that's a little bit more interesting, and that for me is health. In general, the best health podcast, if you want a great overview over a bunch of topics, for me is the Huberman Lab podcast. He just started this podcast fairly recently still, but he has been very consistent in uploading new topics every week, and he talks to a bunch of experts, and it's just really interesting to hear his point of view. He always references a lot of studies and explains things in minute detail. Sometimes I'm not really able to follow along, to be honest, but most of the times he does it in a way that makes it understandable, even if you're not from the field of biology. So if you're interested in kind of getting better sleep, for example, improving your nutrition, improving your workouts, or having more energy during the day, it's a really interesting podcast because it talks about all these topics, and I think in general we all should be thinking about these topics at least a little bit, so I would recommend this podcast to everyone. The next podcast is a little bit more niche but still super interesting to anyone, I think, and that is the Lifespan podcast by David Sinclair. I first listened to the Lifespan audiobook a couple of weeks ago and I found it so interesting, and I was kind of mind blown by some of the stuff that's in there actually. So in this podcast, he basically talks about why we age and why maybe we don't have to. At least that's the subtitle of the book, but it's essentially what the podcast is about as well. So he talks about what you might do with your nutrition or with your workouts, or what kind of supplements you can take if you want to improve your lifespan, at least according to what we can reasonably believe right now due to the science going on. Some of the stuff in there is still in pretty early development, and the science is still only maybe based in rats or something like that, but he states all of that very clearly. For me, it's a case of like, even if it's only in rat studies right now, maybe I want to start implementing some of the routines, because even if it's not as useful for humans, it might still be a good thing to kind of start early. In general, the audiobook is just written more concisely and goes a bit more into detail from time to time. That's just because it was written as a book originally, and the podcast is more of a loose conversation, so you can kind of pick and choose whatever you're into. But for me, I like listening to both because one is a more scientific and more clearly structured view, the other one more conversation that's still pretty scientific but easier to listen to, I think. Okay, the last one in this category for me is kind of a bonus tip, which is the Drive podcast by Peter Attia. I just started listening to this recently, so I can't really tell you a lot about it, but so far it's also been covering a wide range of topics, and I really like the host and I really like listening to the way he explains stuff. So yeah, I think in general with health stuff, it's just great to have multiple views, because sometimes it can be that one person interprets the science in one way and another person has a different way of understanding the studies we have. So I just like having multiple views, and he does a great job as well. By the way, if you've been liking this video so far, please drop a like and consider subscribing to my channel to help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Also, let me know what your favorite podcasts are in the comments so I can listen to them as well. Okay, back to the video. Moving on to the biggest topic, which for me is self-improvement. In general, I really like listening to a lot of self-improvement stuff because there's always some useful insights in there, and I really feel like it has a positive impact on my mind whenever I get new insights about productivity or just self-improvement in general. And in recent history, my favorite podcast in this category has been the Diary of a CEO podcast by Stephen Bartlett. Not only is he himself super successful and has already achieved a lot in his life, but he also has great guests where you can learn a lot from them. In general, I feel like most of these self-improvement podcasts that are kind of at the top have some similarities in terms of the guests. So for me, it matters most whether the host kind of asks the questions I would ask myself in my head while listening to it, and whether or not I like the way he asked those questions. And for me, Stephen Bartlett does a great job as a host, and I really like how he asks the questions and the conversations he has. For example, recently he had an episode with the founder of Whoop, which is a 3-point-something, $1 billion startup now, and it's kind of a fitness band which went up against the Apple Watch and Fitbit and all of these big companies, and he was kind of talking about the story of how he got there, and I just really enjoyed listening to stuff like that. So if you enjoy that too, I would really recommend you to check that one out. Another episode I really enjoyed recently was the one with Christian Horner from the Red Bull F1 team. I really liked the conversation they had, and it was really nice to have someone that's more from the traditional famous people space coming into the podcast space and really having a good long conversation about stuff. And last but not least, I always like Simon Sinek interviews, so I really like the episode with Simon Sinek. And if you like all of those people, or maybe you've heard of them, I would recommend you to check out this podcast. The next one in this category for me is the Deep Dive podcast by Ali Abdaal. He has done a great job of getting great guests that are not on all of these other podcasts, but still very interesting personalities. And so every week it was kind of an opportunity to meet someone that I didn't really know about, but still I always found very interesting. And that's what I really like about this podcast. He doesn't always have the same guests that the other ones have. Sometimes he does, but in general, I feel like he does a great job at getting unique guests and therefore getting unique podcast episodes. One of the best ones for me has to be the one with James Hoffmann that he did. I really like James Hoffmann, and I really learned a lot from him because I love coffee and I really improved my technique, I hope. And having these two YouTubers together for an hour and them having a really nice, honest conversation was just really enjoyable for me as a fan. Okay, next up is going to be a bit of a controversial one maybe, and that is the Jordan Peterson podcast. I know that Jordan Peterson always has a lot of controversy around him, and he's a very polarizing personality in general. But from the stuff I've listened to, I have to say honestly that I really enjoyed the advice, and it really helped me out a lot. I liked his book 12 Rules for Life, and I usually enjoy his podcast. I just enjoy the way he speaks about stuff, and I like the way he articulates himself. And so if there's a good guest, I will always listen to this podcast. For example, there was an episode with Mark Manson recently, which was one of the best podcast episodes I've ever listened to. It was so cool to have these two authors together on one podcast because I felt like they were talking about some of the same topics in their books, but they have such a different way of saying stuff. So if you like the books by Jordan Peterson and if you like the books by Mark Manson, I would definitely recommend you to check out at least that episode. And yeah, in general, I would say I like this podcast. I know he can be controversial, but for me, I just listen to the stuff where I like the guests, and then I also like him as an interviewer because he kind of asks unique questions compared to the other podcasts. Okay, the last one for me is a real wild card pick, and I don't know if it's really popular, but it's Reconcilable Differences by John Siracusa and Merlin Mann. I know that this is not really a traditional self-improvement podcast. There are no interviews, it's just the two guys talking to each other. But I really like this non-traditional format because they don't take themselves too seriously. It's just two guys in, I think, their 40s, and they talk to each other about kind of their experiences in their life. For example, if you listen to the episode about parenting that they did, this is probably my favorite episode ever because it kind of taught me a lot about what I didn't like about my way of growing up and what I maybe want to do differently, but also kind of a first-person perspective of the struggles you will have as a parent. And so I think it's really interesting in general to have people older than you talking about their experiences, and it's great that we have podcasts as a way of kind of listening to them, because obviously I would never have had a conversation with them otherwise. So yeah, if you're kind of adventurous, I would really recommend you to give it a chance. Sometimes it's not really about self-improvement, but as I said, the parenting episode, or there were also episodes about kind of minimalism adjacent topics, so that's kind of keeping your apartment tidy, that I also really enjoyed. So if you're more adventurous, I would really recommend you to check this one out as well. Okay, last but not least, let's move on to the tech category. For me, the tech podcast I've listened to for the past 2 years every week is ATP, or Accidental Tech Podcast. It's pretty Apple focused in general, but that's okay for me because I also really enjoy Apple products, and it's just like 3 software developers or ex-software developers talking about stuff, and in general they have, I feel like, a much better perspective than people on YouTube because they've worked in the industry, or maybe because of their experience. In general, I feel like they have a much more sophisticated view on stuff, and oftentimes I get like new viewpoints from their podcast. For example, when they're talking about the news, it seems like they can kind of see 3 steps ahead where maybe sometimes I can't. And so it's much more interesting to me to listen to this podcast than to just watch YouTube videos about tech news, because that's usually more of a sensationalistic view. So if you want a real in-depth tech discussion every week, I would really recommend you to check out ATP. And the second podcast in the tech category for me is Your Undivided Attention. It's a podcast about the kind of struggles that come from the social media algorithms that we have and the political importance of all of that. And I really enjoy them talking about it because it's a really unique view on tech, and I don't feel like usually people talk about that kind of topic. So if you want to explore something new and want to learn about tech in a way that you probably haven't considered before, I would really recommend you to check this one out as well. Okay, so those are all the podcasts I listen to on a regular basis. Of course, there are other ones out there. For example, I think the Daily Stoic podcast or School of Greatness, the Rich Roll podcast, those are all great podcasts, and there are other ones as well. But these are the ones where I find time every week to listen to them. As I said, drop your recommendations in the comments down below, and I hope you enjoyed this video. That's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.